here in Michigan. As you know, the Congress recently passed and the President signed into law the infrastructure package, and that coupled with funding from the American Rescue Plan sets up the state and local governments across our state for investments in infrastructure. My name is Arnold Weinfeld. I'm Deputy Director of the Institute. And before we get started, I've got a couple of announcements. First, all attendees are muted today. If you have a question or a comment, please use the Q&A box and we will get to it as we move along. Also, the raise hands function is been eliminated for today. This winds up our year with this last forum. Of course, you can see presentations from this and previous forums at our website at ippsr.msu.edu. We're already working on next year's forum lineup, and we'll have an announcement shortly about one in January. We have an evaluation that we would ask you to fill out. Cindy Kyle of our staff. Cindy, if you could put that in the chat right now, that'd be great. There's also a QR code on that we'll have on screen as we end today's discussion. Our new Michigan Political Leadership Program class of 2022 has been named. As you know, we now have new co-directors at MPLP in former State Representative Rudy Hobbs and former State Rep and State Senator Tanya Shoemaker. Our next State of the State podcast can also be heard through our website, and we're looking forward to 2022. And with that, why don't we get started? With us today is Dr. Eric Scorsone, who is Director of the Center for Local Government, Finance and Policy at Michigan State University through Michigan State University Extension. Eric Frederick, Vice President for Community Affairs with Connected Nation, Michigan, and Mark Polsdofer, Policy Advisor with the Michigan Department of Transportation. And with that, we'll start with Dr. Scorsone. Eric?
Great, thank you, Arnold. Okay, so I was asked to kind of provide an overview and then also focus a little bit on some of the water infrastructure, wastewater infrastructure issues that are going on. So first, so the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is about $1 trillion over 5 years. Importantly, that includes about half of that is new money, new investments in a whole series of things around infrastructure, whether it's transportation, water, power, energy, environmental remediation, public lands, broadband, and resiliency, and some green infrastructure kinds of issues. Obviously, we can't talk about all this because it's a huge piece of legislation and has many different aspects to it, both on what's being funded and sort of different strategies. Some, for example, there's things like public-private partnerships being pushed in this bill in some different ways than in the past. And then the rest of the money is essentially coming from existing programs, so forth. So this is a major investment in infrastructure, some of the biggest we've seen in quite a while. The next slide shows we have infrastructure as a share of the economy, which is a good way to measure this. This comes from the Brookings Institute. And so this goes back to 1950. And I think it's kind of interesting just to stop here for a second. So basically the vertical axis shows you share of GDP. The horizontal axis shows you the years. The dotted line there is showing you essentially the share of infrastructure related to the New Deal from the Great Depression. So that was about 1.36% of the economy, just as a standard when the federal government invested heavily. Then you can see sort of that darker line, sort of bluish, blackish line that kind of shows non-inflation adjusted infrastructure spending. So Probably notably in the 1970s, we peaked at about 2%. So that was the last time we saw sort of a major piece of investment. It then fell through the 80s up until about 1990, and then stabilized at about 1% of the economy for the last, essentially 3 decades. Now, under this new plan, we're going to see major spikes. At the yellow line indicates sort of the Infrastructure Act itself. And then that sort of reddish line is essentially that plus the reconciliation bill, which would be the so-called Build Back Better Act. So we would essentially get back to something around New Deal levels of infrastructure spending. Not as historically high as the 1970s, but pretty high from historical comparison. So that just gives you a sense of how big a deal this is and how much money is going into the economy on infrastructure compared to where we've been since the 1980s. I didn't have a lot here, but I did want to kind of briefly talk about, so the American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, also has infrastructure piece in it, specifically water, wastewater, broadband. That was restricted to those areas, did not cover roads, transportation, etc. And ARPA is, of course, being utilized for many different things. It's about $2 trillion bill that was passed earlier this year. ARPA included a whole bunch of other stuff, COVID, medical kinds of spending, etc. So, but ARPA does have a provision for infrastructure. And so there's going to be a lot of, I think, discussion in Michigan, and especially with both state and local governments, around how do we spend the different pots of money? How do we coordinate and leverage versus duplicate? ARPA monies can be used for many other things, such as premium pay, other kinds of social services, revenue losses, etc. But for example, we know local governments will likely spend not an insignificant portion of their ARPA funds, which they're getting about for a little over $4 billion between now and next year, on infrastructure. So again, the question being, how are we spending IIJA? How are we spending ARPA? And then obviously the state may spend its own money on infrastructure as well, perhaps. So, and obviously some supplementals have already passed in some cases. So again, there's going to be some really interesting and challenging policy issues around coordinating all these different legislations. And then if the Build Back Better Act passes as well, the so-called reconciliation bill, that will be yet another pot of money. So again, we have lots of moving pieces right now. It is challenging in some ways to track all of this, but I think that's a really critical issue as we look at this infrastructure policy and how we're going to best use these funds. Our other speakers are going to be talking in a lot more detail, so I'm just going to give a very broad overview. Transportation, $280 billion. This is the new money. Water, $54 billion, primarily to EPA. Broadband, $65 billion, U.S. Department of Commerce. Energy and power, $70 billion to U.S. Energy. We have environmental remediation of $20 billion, again to EPA. Things like Western water, obviously the West has very different issues around water than, for example, we do. And then resiliency around green infrastructure and climate change issues, another $50 billion. So it's a significant investment across many different sectors. Again, this is essentially 5 years. And then if you also include ARPA, you're talking also 5 or 6 years. So this will all be playing out over the next 5 or 6 years. I think given some of the constraints in the labor force, among the contractor community, I think these things will take time to be expended, to be both let and expended. So we will see this over a number of years impacting the economy. I think there will be a short-term economic impact in terms of jobs, income generated. That will happen, but I think probably with something like this, the bigger picture is the long-term implications. Economists have generally estimated a very significant return on investment from infrastructure historically. And so I think we will see probably significant improvements over, a number of years, maybe decades even. So this is certainly has some short-term economic implications, but probably the longer term are far more important in many ways. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the water sector specifically. As I said, there's about 50 billion over 5 years. And this is the IIJA piece there. The ARPA money can also be spent to some extent on water. So the total investment in water and wastewater may be potentially quite a bit more than this. A lot of the money will be going to the state revolving funds. I mean, part of the strategy here was to use existing programs to ensure kind of efficient enactment and implementation of these laws. And so the money's getting out there as quickly as possible. So you have reauthorization of some programs like the drinking water and clean water revolving funds. And then you have small and disadvantaged community programs and the WIFA, Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act. So again, some reauthorization with some new monies. They are specifically in the legislation talking about specific areas such as disadvantaged communities. Obviously in Michigan, the big news recently has been Benton Harbor, which the state has allocated already some money for the Benton Harbor situation. But again, there's certainly others out there. Replacing lead lines, Michigan has already moved forward on passing a significant amount of money for the lead service line issue. And then some of the emerging contaminant issues that we know about, like PFAS. So there's going to be a lot of money targeted to these kinds of areas as a priority. But that said, the state still has a lot of leeway and discretion in how it's going to allocate and prioritize this money. The feds are providing some direction, but certainly there is going to be quite a bit of discretion for the state as well. And local governments. I mean, this is, I will say, a little bit unique, not so much the IIJA, but the ARPA monies, because local governments are getting a significant amount of money. I mean, this is probably the most money being given to local governments directly by the federal government in many decades. And so the local governments have some of their own resources to allocate under their own discretion, which is pretty unique considering the way federal policies generally been enacted over the last few decades. So again, just to kind of look at this from a different way, you've got 20+ billion nationally on safe drinking water, 15 billion on lead pipe issues. Although the estimates are the lead pipe issue, for example, could be well north of 100 billion. So this is essentially a down payment on replacing lead pipes nationally. Wastewater and stormwater, we know, for example, with Detroit and a lot of the flooding issues earlier this year, that's going to be an ongoing issue to address as we get sort of more volatile weather. We have monies for regional waters, which include the Great Lakes, and then a smaller amount for some water improvements. This is a little bit hard to read perhaps, but I'll just kind of briefly talk about this. Is from the 21st Century Infrastructure Report from 2016. Just to kind of give you an idea, we have dams. So we have over 2,000 dams. We know, of course, the catastrophic failure of the dams in Sanford, but there's many other dams in Michigan that need to be addressed, and both Michigan and nationally. And we know a number of those are rated poorly. I would also note part of the challenge here is getting good information. We don't always have great, this Infrastructure Commission report's a great example where, I mean, they did the best they could, but the reality is we don't have great information often on infrastructure, on the quality of assets, on even sometimes where the assets are and what condition they're in. So part of really doing good asset management is getting better information, which hopefully this new funding will get us in a better place. Because even the accounting rules for local governments and the state are often not designed to do such a great job on tracking infrastructure. We have lots of drainage systems, and again, the state has already allocated supplemental funds for this issue, but we have over 35,000 miles of county drains that serve almost 17 million acres. We have over 1,000 community water and wastewater systems. And then this goes through, we have, septic systems, which again, the state, I believe, has already allocated some funding to address septic systems. And then private wells, about a quarter of our residents here in Michigan get their water from that. We have over 1 million wells, which is like the most of any state in the country. So while we have a lot of big public water systems, we also have a lot of well systems. And so again, getting the money and the resources to ensure that those systems are operating properly is going to be critical. A conservative estimate, I would say very conservative, is that we need at least 800 million annually. We have an 800 million annual gap. And again, we've had a lot of deferred maintenance. And again, our government accounting systems are not, and I was just on a committee for the GASB on this, that we often don't have a great sense of the deferred maintenance estimates. That's why these are very conservative estimates. We have a lot, you've probably seen some of the figures about beach closures and so forth, the amount of raw sewage going into our systems. So again, we know there's this IIJA and the ARPA and some of the other acts are putting us in a good place to start funding these issues, but we're still going to have a significant gap. Some of that's going to have to come from local resources, but it's not insignificant, the amount of money that's going to be needed to ensure our water and sewer systems are going to be up to speed over the next few decades. The IIJ is highlighting drinking water. Excuse me. Again, a lot of money for lead lines. It will be done through the state's revolving fund programs to hopefully facilitate getting this money done quickly. But again, even with that, the state can put some priorities in what kind of programs it wants to put that funding into. So that's something the state has some discretion over. Lead service line is going to be critical. A critical aspect here is the grants and principal forgiveness, because a lot of the communities that need lead service line are often lower income communities who can't afford when there's a match or when they have to repay it as a loan. So this is going to be critical that we're going to have grants and principal forgiveness. And also the state match is not required, which hopefully will facilitate, as we've already seen the state putting money forward for this program. Nationally, 11 billion for the Drinking Water Revolving Fund. Again, a lot of this will be targeted as grants and principal forgiveness, and that's going to be critical for our lower income, more distressed communities who will have trouble repaying even low interest loans. So that's a big program that will be that is being reauthorized and funded even higher. Emerging contaminants, this is a kind of newer area where, again, now the feds are saying let's help remediate PFAS, for example, through the SRF program. 4 billion nationally. I mean, that's probably, nationally, when you think about it, that's probably not a huge amount of money, but again, hopefully Michigan can leverage some of that funding to address some of these issues. I think this is a really critical one for our disadvantaged communities, whether it be urban or rural, that these are communities that can help do some of these issues where they've often had those issues. And they've often had to, deal with these kinds of environmental issues. So they're going to have some funding now to address those issues. This is a pilot program regarding access to drinking water. I mean, just, the Free Press today is reporting on the U of M MSU report on affordability of drinking water, which is a big problem both in urban and rural communities in Michigan. So the EPA is being required to look at this. There have been some programs in place around water affordability, but this is going to be a much higher level of engagement on that issue, and some pilot programs putting forward by 2023. And I think this will be critical for communities like a Flint or even some rural communities where water affordability is an issue. I mean, it's a sort of irony in a state like Michigan where we have so much water that we have affordability issues, and that is tied to a whole bunch of issues around the cost of infrastructure and maintaining these systems, et cetera. And so this is a new important issue that hopefully will be coming forward by the EPA. Not to be, again, wastewater and stormwater again. So through the Clean Water SRF, this will be new monies there that can be provided again under the same conditions. Again, emerging contaminants also through the Clean Water SRF. Also stormwater and sewer overflows. Again, not maybe a huge amount of money from a national perspective, but again, providing some grants to help address those issues and providing public notification when there is an overflow. This is an interesting one about helping people connect, moderate low-income households, whether it's construction, repair of household or multi-household septic systems. So again, where we have more of a decentralized approach to wastewater. And also connecting to publicly owned systems. So again, if that's maybe a better idea than versus the septic approach, then there's some actual grants available to lower and moderate income folks to connect to publicly owned systems, which depending on the conditions may be better for them versus trying to run their own system. It will vary obviously under the conditions that they're operating in. And then cybersecurity, we have seen the cyber hacks and things going on. So cybersecurity is not a trivial issue. Well, this isn't a huge amount of money. I think it is something that a lot of the utilities are taking seriously, whether it's ransomware attacks or other things that can shut down systems. And unfortunately, in the world we're in now, that is something we have to consider. If the US gets into some kind of issue with another country, then that country may decide to take action with something like this. And so we have to be prepared to secure our systems. So this is a good start. I mean, I don't think it's nearly enough probably, but something important to at least consider. And then another pilot program on looking at different access to different kinds of water. So again, this is hopefully just giving you a sense of really the broad scope of programs that are being targeted here. There's also programs around consolidation of existing water systems where there might be some economies of scale, especially with there's some of the smaller systems can work together to spread the fixed costs over a bigger service area. So there is some monies for that as well. And I believe Michigan has already appropriated some money for that program. So again, that probably for some of the bigger systems that may not be as advantageous, but for smaller systems, it will be. There are economies of scale in these kinds of municipal water systems. And then finally, just some on the more environmental side, producing energy from wastewater systems. And again, more on the information side. So let me skip to this one. So again, Great Lakes, there is funding for the Great Lakes programs, 1.7 billion for the 12 federally recognized programs, and some smaller programs along estuaries. The WIFA loan program will also be extended 50 million annually. And this can be important for certain communities where they need this kind of support. There is a certain number of projects that will be allowed to go forward in this. And some cases, there's a minimum project size or population thresholds. So EPA is developing EPA is the primary agency for most of this. They are developing guidance on the use of the funds. The funds are going to be distributed through the state revolving funds primarily. And then Michigan will start taking applications for SRF projects. Some of that's already been moved forward through some supplementals, especially on the water side. But certainly we expect a lot more happening over the next few months as the legislature finishes their work on this. And so thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that information. There's certainly a lot there. And just to let our audience know, we'll be posting a recording of this to our website, and the presentations will also be made available as well if you have further questions. And we are starting to get some questions in, but I think we'll hold those to the end, and we'll move now to Eric Frederick of Connect Nation, Michigan. Eric has been involved in broadband issues and adoption for over 2 decades here in the state. So Eric, why don't you talk a bit about the broadband piece of this?
All right, thanks, Arnold. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
All right. Thank you for having me. Like Arnold said, Our organization, Connected Nation Michigan, has been working with the state of Michigan now for quite some time to address various challenges of the digital divide, from high-speed infrastructure to broadband adoption and affordability to devices and digital literacy and so on. And so we see the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act as a once-in-a-generation opportunity to really address the digital divide in the state. Just like many of the other infrastructure platforms that were included in the IIJA, broadband has about $60 billion to $65 billion for broadband infrastructure and digital equity. And those funds are really broken up into 4 primary funding programs and then 2 policy-related efforts, which are really critical to contributing to closure of the digital divide. The biggest of these programs is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, or the BEAD program. And this represents the most significant federal broadband investment ever. When we look back at the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act back in 2008, there was significant funding in that for broadband as well, but this is 8 times as much. So it really is an unprecedented opportunity to solve the broadband challenges that we have in the state. Now, the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program is primarily for infrastructure. So this is for high capacity, high speed broadband infrastructure. And one of the differences between this and some of the other federally funded broadband programs in the past is that it is going to be administered by states. So the state of Michigan is going to play a significant role in administering the funds that are allocated to the state in solving these challenges. The timeline for this is a little bit drawn out, and I have a summary timeline here in a little bit. But these programs are going to be administered by the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. And they're part of the Department of Commerce, and they've been working on broadband issues for quite some time now. They're going to issue a notice of funds available within 180 days. So we expect to see that in May of next year, where states will start to file their letters of intent and begin planning activities and so on. And at that time, the state can access up to $5 million to develop a 5-year action plan for the use of their future allocation of these funds. The majority of these funds won't be allocated to states until new FCC broadband coverage maps are created. So last year, the Broadband Data Act passed in Congress, and it was funded by the COVID relief bills that passed in December of last year. And this map will create, or is intended to create, more granular broadband coverage information at the FCC. That data now is generally overstated in some places, understated in others, and doesn't get to the fine granularity that's needed to thoroughly invest these dollars. And the only problem with that is that those maps aren't going to be ready until we estimate May of 2023. So there's a little bit of a lead up to states being able to implement these funds. However, in the next 18 months or so, there's going to be a lot of pre-planning activities that need to take place in order to prepare for that. So there is a 25% match requirement for this BEAD program, and that match can come from either sub-grantees. So states are intended to bring in the dollars from the feds and then award sub-grants to those that are actually out there building the infrastructure and connecting homes and businesses and community anchor institutions across the state. And either states can provide that 25% match, or sub-grantees can as well. And again, funding must be used to build networks that are capable of at least 100 by 20 megabits per second. That's not a ceiling, that's a floor. So it's not a maximum advertised speed of 100 by 20 megabits per second. That's the minimum that's going to be required. So when we look at the broadband infrastructure funding priorities that were outlined in the Infrastructure Act, there's really 3 groups, and they are ranked in this order. So states are going to need to identify every location within their borders that is unserved by broadband at 25 by 3 megabits per second. This is the current definition of broadband that is used by the FCC. It shows up in a number of policy and other funding documents at the state of Michigan, as well as at the federal level. So that's the current definition of broadband. And in the Infrastructure Act, they're using that as the definition of unserved.
What do you mean by 25 by 3, Eric?
Yep. So 25 megabits per second is your download speed, and 3 is the upload speed. So there's 2 parts of your broadband connection. The download we can think of as the consumption speed. So that's how fast you can download content to your machine. And then the upload side is the creation side. So that's how fast content comes from you out to the broader internet or wherever you're sending it to. And so the speed of a broadband connection is always measured in that uploaded download fashion. And a megabits per second, a 25 by 3 megabit per second connection is kind of a slow end cable connection. To give you some context, it's definitely a slower end of a fiber connection. It's probably on the upper end of a DSL connection, or one that goes over the phone lines. So just to give you some context, and with a 25 by 3 connection, you could probably support two people in a household that are streaming content or doing Zoom two-way communication, but much more than that, and it starts to slow down quite a bit. Just again for some context. So states are going to have to identify all of those locations in their borders that are unserved. The next group that gets priority are underserved locations, and those are places that have 25 by 3 megabits per second, but not 100 by 20 megabits per second. Like I said, that new standard that's being set through this Infrastructure Act. And on this map here, I know it's the borders get a little fuzzy at this scale, but the bright pink areas are places in the state of Michigan where we estimate are unserved. So that 25 by 3 definition. And then there's kind of some mauve colored areas underneath that. And those are the underserved locations at 100 by 20. So this just gives you an idea of the geographic scale that we're talking about in places in the state that are going to be receiving the benefit of these infrastructure dollars to finally connect these locations. Finally, the third funding priority group are community anchor institutions. So this is a very wide group. This is schools, colleges and universities, healthcare institutions, public safety facilities, local government offices, state government offices, libraries, those types of institutions without a 1 gigabit per second connection. So not only does the state have to identify every household and business that falls into these first 2 categories, they also have to identify every community anchor institution that doesn't have a gigabit per second, because the state, like I said, is going to be responsible for developing a plan to serve all 3 of these priority areas in order, according to the Infrastructure Act. One of the other big components of the Infrastructure Act is the Digital Equity Act. So there's the BEAD program, which focuses primarily on infrastructure, and that's the biggest funded component. And then there's the Digital Equity Act. You can almost think of them as supply and demand. So the Digital Equity Act is really designed to overcome the affordability, the device, and the digital literacy issues related to adopting and subscribing to a broadband service within a home. So the Digital Equity Act is $2.75 billion, and it creates 2 distinct grant programs. The first are for states, so it's a state digital equity capacity grant program, and then there's a competitive grant program, which is run very, very similar to a federal competitive grant program. And the purpose is to support digital equity and digital inclusion. So if you haven't heard those terms before, digital equity is really the state that we're looking for. It's the condition where every individual and community has the IT capacity that is needed for full participation in society and the economy. That's digital equity. That's what we're striving towards. And digital inclusion are the activities that get us there. So those are really important definitions. And this represents one of the first times that the federal government has really funded efforts aimed at digital equity and digital inclusion. So that was really great to see that it's not all about infrastructure. Once that infrastructure is there, we have to address these other challenges, like I said, affordability, devices, and digital literacy as well. So the most exciting part of this for states is that there is the capacity grant program, and there's 2 portions of this. The first is a planning grant. So that's $60 million for states to develop a digital equity plan for their state. And those plans should be pretty comprehensive in nature, should include extensive and robust outreach and engagement with key stakeholders to really establish a plan for addressing those other adoption-related challenges of the digital divide. Again, affordability, devices, and digital literacy. And then once that plan is created, states can then go back to the NTIA for implementation dollars, and that's $1.44 billion for implementation of those plans once those plans are completed, and those are distributed over 5 years based on a number of different criteria, population and demographics and so on. So a little bit of a look at the timeline, and this is a little bit in flux as the NTIA works to implement these programs and so on, but there are some hard and fast dates that were included in the Infrastructure Act that we can work from. The key deadline here for publishing the notice of funds is May of 2022. But leading up to that, there's a lot that states are going to have to do to get ready for that, including developing stakeholder outreach plans for that 5-year plan and the digital equity plan that I just described, and also collecting detailed service information to prepare their initial proposals to the NTIA. Like I said, states are responsible for identifying every single one of the unserved and underserved and community anchor institution locations in the state, and that's going to take some time. So there is quite a bit of lead up of time where that can happen. And like I said before, a lot of these funds won't be able to be allocated to states until the new FCC map is made public, and that is not expected to happen until May of 2023. So the next 18 months, as it relates to broadband, is really critical for states to build capacity and to start these planning activities in earnest to really be ready to hit the ground running when those allocations are made and the funds can finally start going out the door and networks to be constructed. A couple of the other programs of the Infrastructure Act, broadband affordability was a big piece. So back in December of last year, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program was created, and this program offered a $50 per month discount on home internet service to eligible households, primarily low income, those that have had their income affected by COVID and so on. And because that was an emergency program, it was only temporary. The Infrastructure Act creates the Affordable Connectivity Program, which essentially renames the Emergency Broadband Benefit and makes it permanent and allocates an additional $14.2 billion to that program. There were a couple key changes, however. The subsidy, the monthly subsidy to eligible households dropped from $50 to $30 per month. However, it did expand the eligibility for the program. So instead of using 125% of federal poverty as the benchmark for the emergency broadband benefit, now eligibility based on income is up to 200% of the federal poverty line. And also WIC participants are eligible to participate as well. So we win some, you lose some on this one. But again, this is the first time beyond basic phone subsidies that the federal government has really gotten involved in addressing the affordability challenge of the digital divide. A couple other policy elements from the Infrastructure Act. The FCC is going to enact consumer broadband labels, so very much like the nutrition facts you see on food. The FCC actually proposed this back in 2016 to really break down the costs of your internet service and provide more information to consumers. So this will be implemented within, I believe, the next year. So ISPs will have to provide this information as part of their broadband packages. And then finally, the other policy one related to the FCC is digital discrimination. So within 2 years, the FCC must adopt rules that facilitate equal access to broadband service. So making sure that there are rules in place that prevent digital discrimination based on income, race, ethnicity, color, religion, national origin, and the FCC has to take steps to eliminate such discrimination. So a lot of great policies, a lot of great funding programs for broadband in the next 6 to 18 months are going to be very critical for the state of Michigan to get everything in order to be able to take advantage of these funds. So a little bit about what's happening at the state. Back in June of this year, Governor Whitmer created the Michigan Office of High-Speed Internet within the Department of Labor and Economic Opportunity. And Leo is currently working with the legislature to get the required FTEs and funding to that office to really start to build its capacity in preparation for all of the funds that are coming because of the Infrastructure Act. They're also working to concurrently update the state broadband roadmap to include these considerations for elements of the Infrastructure Act and all the pre-planning that needs to happen. And the NTIA is estimating that states will need to significantly increase capacity to implement these various components. That's absolutely true. I was on a call earlier this week with other state broadband leaders, and they are ramping up their staffing very quickly because they see the the compliance and transparency that's going to come with implementing billions in federal grants, and we're just going to need it. And we also have the Connecting Michigan Task Force, which is an interagency working group that's working to coordinate a lot of this effort related to broadband and the digital divide at the state level. So finally, some of the very next steps, again, building that capacity in the Office of High-Speed Internet to make sure that we can, as a state, have the capacity to efficiently and swiftly implement the allocations from the Infrastructure Act, developing outreach and engagement plans for both the action plan required for the BEAD program and the digital equity plan for that portion of the program, getting letters of intent around for both of those efforts. And then, of course, collecting granular connectivity data for those unserved and underserved locations so that we can make sure that all of those locations in Michigan have a plan to be served with these funds. So with that, I will stop my share and turn it back over to Arnold.
Appreciate that. A lot of information there. We're getting a number of questions that come in. I'd like to get through all the presentations, and then we'll get to the questions. So if our speakers can hang with us, that'd be greatly appreciated. Next, we turn to Mark Polsdofer, a policy analyst with the Michigan Department of Transportation. Mark, we've heard about water and sewer and a broad overview. We've heard about broadband, and now, last but certainly not least, it's about roads and bridges and public transit. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Arnold. Before I get started, I wanted to kind of highlight what the difference is for infrastructure this go round to what happened a decade ago when President Obama came in and they launched the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. If folks remember the way that rolled out, it was designed to have states and local communities provide a list of essentially shovel-ready projects that would be available for funding. So when that program got underway, the structure was very different. The way this IIJA Act works is it reauthorizes the Surface Transportation Program for 5 years. And that provides Michigan and MDOT and local communities the necessary, predictable, and sustainable funding over the course of that time to advance our multimodal transportation goals. What Michigan will realize over the course of this 5 years now is $7.9 billion total. And that is through the IIJA, that's roughly a $2.4 billion increase in new funding. And what that works out to yearly is about 473 million. And the procedural breakdowns we have are for bridge replacement, rehab, and preservation. Over the course of this 5 years, we will see an extra 563 million. It's been highlighted by Eric Frederick earlier, some of the EV issues, but Michigan will be receiving $110 million to enhance our electric vehicle charging network and program throughout the state. That is going to be a multi-departmental effort being led through Leo's Office of Future Mobility and Electrification. And we are in close contact and involved with conversations on getting all of this going. We also have ferry boat enhancements, and that's to the tune of 8.7 million. This all isn't purely infrastructure, though. We also have transit funds which roughly $47 million increased annually compared to the standard amount that we had received prior to the passage of this. And the important thing for the transit funds is this sustainable increase over the course of 5 fiscal years will allow transit agencies to start planning for their service improvements and enhancements that they can create and be sustainable. And some of the things that will be focused on are filling the mobility gaps that currently prevent access to some citizens, and increasing funding and support of some new demonstration of new technologies that improve efficiency and improve the equitable delivery of services. And the state and local agencies will partner as this gets underway to determine the best use of these funds that will come to Michigan. There's also passenger rail fund improvements nationally for Amtrak. That is 66 billion. Some of that will be coming to Michigan, and there will be competitive grant opportunities to have communities reach out and get involved. At this point, we don't have a total that we can share. There is also at the national level $25 billion in aviation funds, and that overall breakdown is 15 billion for capital improvement on runways, taxiways, and non-terminal upgrades. The second would be discretionary grants for terminal construction and improvement. And the final 5 billion of that is going to be available for air traffic control improvements. So one of the I'll get to that question, Barbara, in a minute. So again, the key for this whole program is it's kind of piggybacking on the FAST Act and providing enhanced funding for us to improve and double down and get our programs underway the way the lack of funding has hamstrung us in the past. And what we've done in the last fiscal year at the state level is put together a bridge program where we have identified a number of the closed bridges around the state. And so that program is just getting started now. And the governor, when she put that proposal on the table, focused on the fact that citizens in Michigan do not care whether it's a state of Michigan MDOT bridge or whether those are local bridges. So the improvements to replacing bridges, in many cases, in the next 2 years under that program, you're going to see that they are local bridges being replaced and upgraded. So the 563 million in additional funds to do this will allow us to get a whole lot more improved and rehabbed if they don't need replacement. And So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you to all of our presenters today. We do have quite a few questions, and one of those you noted, Mark, was from Barbara Bellinger asking for clarification on the $47 million annual increase for transit funds. Is that solely from the IAJA?
Yes, that is an increase on top of the roughly 200 million that we have coming through the existing FAST Act. So that is going to be 47 million additional, but because of IIJA.
Okay. Frederick from Mitchell Shapiro, regarding the 25/3 and 100/20 speed minimums, what percentage of households in these areas will need to lack these speeds to be qualified as that particular area?
Yeah, this is something that's different than other past federally funded programs. So in the past, especially with FCC related programs, they use census blocks as the unit of measure for determining areas that were served or unserved at whatever speed they were funding. But the act is very clear in that it uses the word location, not area or census block. So unless the NTIA issues something different in their notice of funds available when they issue that in May or so, I believe the intent is that the states need to identify the actual address level location where these unserved households and businesses are in the state. So it's a level of granularity that we haven't seen from the feds in the past. The FCC maps that are being updated and changed, that new methodology gets to a much greater and finer level of granularity than in the past. And so looking at the actual individual address level locations, I think is the level of granularity that they're looking for from states in determining where the funds should be spent.
Interesting. Okay, here's one from Alif Clark. For an area that, and you all were very expansive here, but the Infrastructure Act provides $73 billion for energy and power. Can anyone give us any insights or provide an example of how and to who that money will flow? Any thoughts on that? I gather this is for upgrading electrification and utilities and the like.
Yeah, I don't go for utilities. And I want to be clear, it's not necessarily my area of expertise per se, but it is a huge investment in the grid, the electric grid, and really looking at clean electricity. So a lot of the money will be going to utilities, potentially consumers in terms of their adjustments to this new smart grid. And also pretty big improvement to the energy assistance program for low-income households. But I think, yeah, the core of it is really, I think it's close to 60 billion in the smart grid system and things around that. So.
Okay. And Eric, you also noted in your presentation, especially on water and sewer, about the amount of raw sewage. And so we have a question from an attendee. Is it the state of Michigan or entities that are poorly managing waste? Is it just a matter of upgrading systems? Why does so much raw sewage filter out?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. I'm an economist, not an engineer, so I want to be careful how to answer this. I believe a lot of it has to do with just systems that are old and sort of out of date and not kept up as well as they should. Whose fault is it? I mean, probably the blame can go around, honestly, to many entities, but local governments generally are and authorities are the ones who actually manage these facilities. The state provides, and the state and federal government provide regulatory oversight, financing. I mean, I think you have to kind of say all of them are in the boat of why this is happening. Hopefully these investments will reduce the problem, but we all have to be vigilant. And I think, hopefully we can move towards zero, but we may never get to zero, but I think a lot of it has to do with just poorly poorly updated systems that we haven't invested enough in over time.
And along with that, I don't know that any one of our panelists, and I don't have this information at my fingertips, but Mary Ablin asked, do we know the extent of PFAS contamination in Michigan? We've heard a lot about certainly up north in the old Wordsmith Air Force Base area. Do any of you know if we have those sites identified to a great extent? Yeah.
I don't. I know. I think we're becoming more aware, but I don't think we have a full inventory at this time.
Yeah, I don't know that we do either. Thank you.
There is at Arnold a kind of a task force that meets fairly regularly across different state departments to work with Eagle on this. I'm certainly not the point person on that, but I know there's across Ag, Eagle, MDOT, and for example, where we have had oversight of some airport related things, and they've used those chemicals as fire retardant. We're moving forward with processes that don't utilize those anymore at airports, and MDOT is kind of cutting edge on that, and a lot of other states are looking to us now on how we've made that transition.
Well, speaking about, let's stick with MDOT for a second. We've got a question, and I know it comes up every time, the large rush of infrastructure season is upon us, about coordinating infrastructure projects between the public utilities, between MDOT, so that folks understand schedules, so that when the new street or the new road gets paved, it isn't ripped up a month or two later for say broadband infrastructure after that. What efforts is the state looking at or thinking about in terms of coordinating all of these projects that are going to be going on out there? Mark, any idea on that one?
Yes, that's again why this is a positive. The fact that this is spread over multiple fiscal years, it allows us to plan with our 5-year program, getting the projects dealt with and looking at utility relocation and other things. So the fantastic thing about the funding is it allows us to start programming them and working with local communities and making sure that we are coordinating and can make adjustments to deal with water, sewage, broadband. In this case, that'll be an evolving need as that program launches. But we always do try and communicate and share information and timelines and make adjustments as needed to take care of those. And I did see John Dulmus had some questions, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark. That was my next one on my list.
On with that, the lower costs for projects because of economies of scale. We actually have our bridge bundling program from the fiscal 22 budget just getting underway. And that actually will be looking at regions where we're going to be working on these bridge projects, and it will be working with contractors to do exactly just that, find where there can be similarities in design, and then where possible, just replicating things, and again, using those economies of scale to purchase the needed supplies at a greater bulk, so we can realize those savings, and not having each particular project be standalone in its own silo will create much in savings and allow us to stretch the dollars further and do more improvements. And then in terms of lack of available materials or workforce, again, the great thing about this program being kind of built up on top of the FAST Act is we are looking at multi-year funding, and it's not kind of like what we see sometimes in state budget bills where there'll be an earmarked project for something and nobody knows until that bill passes about the demand or need to have a project done. So then people, scramble, but there's no predictability. With this, we have predictability and enhanced funds. So it allows us to reach out to contractors and start planning these things for the second, third, fourth, fifth year. And with that predictability, they're able to adjust their workforce and their own equipment purchases and maintenance in order to sufficiently be ready to tackle all this work as we get the whole program underway.
Eric Scorsone, though, as an economist, you noted that workforce shortages might be an issue moving forward, let alone supply chain issues. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big concern. Number one, getting the workers. I mean, the ability to retain people is challenging. The number of contractors with the amount of work going on. I mean, I think Mark's right. It's good that this is a long period of time because I think it will take a number of years to gear up and get all this done, and that's okay. I think we all would like the roads repaired today, but it's going to take time, and getting the improved broadband, et cetera, but clean water. But these are all goals we're going to we're going to need to take our time to do it and do it well. And given the supply constraints, it's just a reality we're facing. I would agree also on the working together. I think it's critical that the state work with local governments and other entities to make sure we're doing this the right way, that the leverage versus duplication is hopefully the order of the day, so that we use these funds as efficiently as possible.
One final question before we go for Eric Frederick. Got a question about internet to labor housing camp, migrant labor housing camps. Do you see opportunities for internet access to be provided out to such entities moving forward?
I would imagine so. It's actually one of the data layers I have from MDART to make sure that we're considering those types of locations. I mean, migrant labor is critical to the agriculture industry in the state, and ensuring that they have access to internet for education, access to healthcare and benefits and everything that they need is really critical. So I think the answer should be yes in any planning activities that the state does. And if I could really quick jump back on the previous question, we've from a broadband perspective, there was a big tranche of funding that was released to the state to internet service providers in Michigan last year through the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. That was a small amount. It was $263 million or so to connect 250,000 locations in the state. And those companies are underway in using those funds to build. And even at that scale, they're running into issues with drain permits, road crossing permits, rights of way access, misdig capacity. Misdig's capacity just to come out and flag areas in the right of way. They're looking to build 5 to 10 miles in a day or trench that much fiber, and MSDIG can't do any more than a mile or two. So there's definitely going to be some capacity issues, spread across various parts of state and local government that are going to need to be addressed if we're all going to coordinate these efforts together. And I think the Michigan Infrastructure Council's project planning portal is going to be a fantastic tool to help with coordinating all of these efforts especially between the public and the private sector, and ensuring that when there's a public sector project going on, the private sector, especially in the telecom side, can come in and possibly leverage an open right of way to get infrastructure in the ground sooner. So I think that's going to be a really key tool. And then looking at some of the other ways to increase capacity among these various levels of approval that are needed for such projects.
Well, I want to thank our speakers for taking time from their busy schedules for all the information they put forth. Of course, there's a lot there. Thank you for taking time to our attendees, and we'll all make this IPPSR Public Policy Forum possible. We've got a QR code there if you want to take a moment to get to our evaluation. Cindy Kyle of our staff, who has also put that in the chat. And again, greatly appreciate everyone's participation today. I have no doubt that we'll be touching on these issues again, given the length of the programs that are coming and the money's being starting to be appropriated by the legislature. So look for more information on IPPSR Public Policy Forums in 2022. And everyone have a great and safe holiday and Happy New Year. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having us, Arnold.
Thank you.
You as well. Bye.